The morning sun rose slowly over the small town, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and pink. The air was fresh, filled with the gentle songs of birds perched on nearby trees. At the edge of town stood a small community hospital, known not for its size, but for its warmth. The nurses greeted each other with kind smiles. The security guard waved at the people passing by, and the smell of fresh tea filled the reception area. It was just another ordinary day, or at least, that was what everyone believed. Outside the hospital, the streets were still quiet. A light breeze moved through the trees, making their leaves dance softly. A few bicycles passed by, their riders heading to work. A shopkeeper across the street swept the front of his little store, humming a tune under his breath. Life was slow and calm, exactly the way people liked it in that town. No one had the slightest idea that something extraordinary was about to happen that would stay in their memories for years. Near the corner of the street, behind a small bush, a little puppy was exploring the world in its own playful way. It was a tiny brown and white dog, no bigger than a shoebox. Its fur was messy but soft, and its eyes were round and full of curiosity. The puppy had no home. It wandered around the neighborhood every day, searching for food scraps or someone kind enough to give it a biscuit. It wasn't afraid of people, but most of them were always in a hurry, so it spent most of its time alone. That morning, the puppy was sniffing the ground near the hospital fence, chasing the smell of something interesting. Its tiny tail wagged as it followed the scent, moving from one spot to another. Then, it stopped suddenly. Just a few steps away, behind a bush near the hospital gate, it noticed a black bag. The bag looked old and a little torn, but what caught the puppy's attention was the faint sound coming from inside. At first, the puppy tilted its head, unsure of what it was hearing. Then it moved closer, sniffing the bag carefully. The bag was slightly open at the top. A soft, weak sound came again, a sound so quiet that no one else on the street noticed. But the puppy did. It pushed its small nose against the bag, as if trying to understand. Something inside was moving. The little dog gave a small bark, but it was still early in the morning, and no one was close enough to hear. So the puppy did the only thing it could think of. It grabbed the corner of the black bag with its tiny teeth and began to pull Dot at first. The bag did not move much. It was heavier than the puppy expected. But the little dog didn't give up. It pulled again, harder this time, stepping back slowly. The bag moved an inch, then another. The puppy's paws slipped on the smooth ground, but it kept going. A couple of hospital staff members who were standing near the gate noticed something moving. They turned their heads and saw a funny sight. A small dog trying its best to drag a big black bag. One of the guards laughed softly. "Look at that little one," he said to the nurse standing next to him. "What is it doing?" The nurse smiled. "Probably just found someone's trash." "Poor thing must be hungry," she replied. They thought it was nothing serious. People often left things near the gate by mistake, and stray dogs sometimes played with them. No one felt alarmed. But the puppy didn't stop. It looked determined, almost as if it had a purpose. It kept dragging the bag closer and closer to the entrance, its little body shaking with effort. Its tiny paws left faint marks on the dusty ground as it moved. The puppy finally reached the steps of the hospital. By now, a few more people had noticed it. A woman waiting for her appointment giggled softly and pointed at the puppy. A young boy who was sitting with his mother clapped his hands, enjoying the little dog's show of strength. It seemed like a cute moment, something lighthearted on an ordinary morning. But then something changed. The puppy let go of the bag and barked, not playfully, but in a sharp, urgent way. It barked again and again, running around the bag as if trying to get someone's attention. Its little tail wasn't wagging anymore. Instead, it stood still, its ears up, its eyes fixed on the bag. This sudden change made the guard frown. "That's strange," he said softly. He stepped closer, his smile fading just a little. He noticed how the puppy kept returning to the bag, barking, and then looking at him, as if asking him to do something. The sound inside the bag was too soft for him to hear yet, but something about the dog's behavior made him curious. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, nurses were getting ready for their daily routine. The reception phone rang with the usual calls. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the fresh morning air, and doctors walked quickly through the hallways with clipboards in hand. None of them knew what was happening just outside the door. The puppy barked again, louder this time. One of the nurses near the entrance finally walked over. She bent down a little, smiling gently. "Hey, little one, what's going on?" she said in a soft voice. She thought maybe the puppy had found some food inside the bag. But when she took a step closer, she noticed how carefully the puppy guarded the bag, almost protectively. That made her curious. She crouched down, and the moment she got near, she heard it, a faint, weak sound coming from inside the bag. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the rustle of paper or the clink of metal. It was something softer. She leaned closer, trying to listen carefully. The puppy sat down right next to the bag, as if to say, "See? I told you something's in here." The nurse looked around. "Can someone come here for a second?" she called out. Another nurse hurried over, followed by the security guard. By now, the early morning calm was slowly being replaced by whispers and curious looks. A few patients near the door leaned forward, trying to see what was happening. The puppy stayed still, its big eyes fixed on the adults. It seemed to understand that it had finally gotten their attention. The first nurse carefully touched the corner of the bag. It was slightly damp and cool. She slowly opened the top a little more, and the sound became clearer. She gasped softly, covering her mouth. The second nurse's eyes widened too. Something, or rather someone, was inside that bag. But neither of them spoke yet. They didn't want to alarm the people around them. The puppy wagged its tail slowly now, as if it knew it had done something important. It looked tired from dragging the heavy bag all the way from the bush to the hospital steps. A small drop of water slid down its nose, but it didn't move away. It stayed right there, sitting proudly beside the bag like a tiny guard. The security guard picked up the bag carefully. It was heavier than he expected. He exchanged a quick glance with the nurses. "Let's take it inside," one of them said quietly. They didn't want to cause panic outside, but their faces were serious now. Something about this felt different. The puppy followed closely behind them, refusing to leave Dot as they stepped through the hospital doors. The warm air of the lobby mixed with a strange feeling of suspense. People turned their heads, whispering to each other. A little child pointed at the dog and asked his mother what was happening. The mother didn't answer. She just stared. The nurse carried the bag gently to the emergency room area. Doctors who were preparing for their morning rounds looked up curiously. "What's that?" one of them asked. The nurse didn't reply immediately. She was focused, careful, and a little nervous. She placed the bag on a clean table. The puppy sat by the door, watching silently. The senior doctor walked over. "What's going on here?" he asked calmly, though his eyes were sharp. The nurse explained in a few quick sentences how the puppy had dragged the bag all the way to the hospital gate and how they had heard a sound from inside. The doctor frowned slightly, leaning closer. He listened carefully, and then he heard it too, a faint, soft noise. His expression changed in an instant. Something was definitely inside. While all this was happening, the little puppy simply waited. It didn't understand the serious looks or the growing whispers. It only knew one thing. It had found something important, and it needed help. Its ears twitched as it listened to the strange sounds coming from behind the doors. The world inside the hospital was much brighter and warmer than the street outside, but the puppy didn't move an inch. It stayed there, loyal to the mysterious black bag it had dragged in. Outside, the calm morning was slowly turning into a day that no one would ever forget. What began as a normal, peaceful day in a small town hospital was becoming something extraordinary. None of the doctors, nurses, or even the curious patients standing in the hallway knew what surprise waited inside that old black bag. They only knew one thing. This was no ordinary morning anymore. And at the heart of it all stood a tiny, brave puppy, the little hero who had started it all. The emergency room felt different that morning. Usually, it was filled with quiet footsteps, the soft beeping of machines, and the calm voices of nurses preparing for their rounds. But now there was something else in the air, a quiet tension that no one could ignore. The black bag that had been dragged in by the tiny puppy sat on a metal table in the corner. Everyone's eyes seemed to drift toward it, as if it held a secret they couldn't quite understand yet. The senior doctor walked slowly toward the table. He was a calm man who had worked at the hospital for many years. He had seen many strange things in his career, but there was something about this bag that felt different. It wasn't just what was inside. It was how it had arrived, carried by a stray puppy. That was something no one could explain. The nurse who had first discovered the bag stood close by, nervously holding her hands together. Her heart was still racing from the moment she had heard the faint sound. Another nurse stood beside her, holding a clean white cloth, unsure of what would happen next. A few other staff members had gathered near the doorway. Even people who normally avoided the emergency room couldn't help but peek in. The puppy sat near the door, its big brown eyes fixed on the bag. It didn't bark anymore, but its ears were alert, and its little body seemed ready to react to any movement. The doctor put on a pair of clean gloves. The room grew quiet. Even the usual hum of machines seemed softer than usual. He slowly unzipped the bag. The sound of the zipper seemed to echo in the silence. At first, no one could see much, just some cloth wrapped loosely around something inside. Then the soft sound came again. It was fragile, almost like a whisper. The nurses leaned in slightly, holding their breath. The doctor carefully pulled the cloth aside, and what he saw made him freeze for a second. Inside the bag, wrapped in thin fabric, was a tiny baby. Its face was pale and small, its hands tucked close to its chest. The child's eyes were closed, and its breath was shallow but there. For a heartbeat, no one moved. They were all too shocked to speak. The nurse gasped softly, covering her mouth. "It's a baby," she whispered. Her voice was so low it almost got lost in the stillness of the room. The doctor's calm voice broke through the shock. "Get the warmer ready. Call the pediatric team now," he said firmly. That snapped everyone back into motion. The room suddenly came alive. One nurse ran to the incubator, turning on the machine to warm it up. Another nurse prepared clean blankets. A third nurse ran to make the call for extra help. The hospital, which had felt peaceful just a few minutes earlier, was now buzzing with quiet urgency. The puppy, sensing the sudden rush, tilted its head but stayed in place. It seemed to understand that something serious was happening. It didn't try to run inside or bark. It just sat there, watching. The doctor gently lifted the baby out of the bag. The fabric was cold and a little damp. He held the child carefully, supporting its tiny head with both hands. He could feel the weak but steady pulse under his fingers. "We need to move fast," he said. The baby's body was cold, and it needed warmth and care immediately. The nurses worked quickly. They placed the baby inside the warm incubator, wrapping it in soft cloth. One nurse gently stroked the baby's tiny hand with her gloved finger, whispering soothing words. Another nurse adjusted the temperature and checked the oxygen. The doctor stood beside them, checking the child's breathing. For a moment, Everything else faded away. The noise of the hallway, the curious whispers, even the little puppy sitting by the door. The only thing that mattered now was the fragile life lying on the table. Outside the emergency room, more people had gathered near the lobby. Word had started to spread. Patients waiting for their appointments were whispering to each other. "Did you hear? That little dog brought something in," someone said. "They say it's a baby," another replied in a hushed voice. No one knew the full story, but everyone felt the weight of it. This was not something that happened every day in their quiet town. Back in the emergency room, the baby let out a soft, weak cry. It was barely a sound, but it was enough to make everyone freeze for a second. The doctor's eyes softened. "That's a good sign," he said gently. The nurses exchanged hopeful looks. They worked with practiced hands but tender hearts, adjusting the blankets and making sure the child was warm and stable. The nurse who had first seen the puppy stepped closer to the incubator. Her heart was still pounding, but now it wasn't fear. It was something else. A mix of shock, hope, and protectiveness. She glanced at the door where the puppy sat and whispered, "You're the little hero, aren't you?" The puppy tilted its head, as if it understood. The doctor instructed the team to check the baby's heartbeat, breathing, and temperature. "We'll need to inform the authorities and child care services," he added in a calm but serious tone. Everyone nodded. They knew there were procedures to follow, but for now, the priority was to make sure the baby was safe. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Every small sound, every breath, every tiny cry mattered. The doctor monitored the baby closely, occasionally giving quiet instructions to the nurses. Slowly, the child's breathing grew a little stronger. The nurse wrapped the baby in a fresh, warm blanket and gently stroked its head. Meanwhile, the puppy finally stood up. It walked slowly toward the door of the emergency room, its small paws making soft sounds on the floor. It didn't try to go inside. It just sat closer now, as if to keep watch. One of the security guards who had helped earlier brought it a small bowl of water. The puppy lapped it up quickly, then returned its gaze to the room dot in another corner of the hospital. A clerk made a few important calls to child services, the local police, and a social worker. This wasn't just a medical case now. It was something much bigger. But in the emergency room, the focus stayed on the baby and the quiet miracle of its arrival. The senior doctor leaned against the counter for a second, taking a breath. He had seen many things in his career, but he couldn't stop thinking about that tiny dog dragging the heavy bag all the way to the hospital. If it hadn't done that, no one knew what would have happened. It was as if fate itself had chosen that puppy to be a messenger dot as the minutes passed. The baby's breathing became more regular. The nurses gently smiled, relief softening their tired faces. The puppy wagged its tail slowly, as if it could sense the change in the air. People outside whispered less now. Instead, they watched with quiet wonder. A few reporters from a local news station soon arrived after hearing whispers of the strange event. The hospital staff didn't allow them inside, but the sight of the little puppy sitting patiently near the door was enough to make them curious. One of them snapped a quiet picture from a distance. They didn't know the full story yet, but they could already feel it was special. The nurse who had first found the bag walked over to the puppy and crouched down. "You really did something amazing," she said softly. The puppy licked her hand. For the first time since the morning began, she smiled, a real, warm smile. "You saved a life," she whispered. The doctor joined her a moment later. "This little one deserves a medal," he said with a small laugh. His voice carried a mixture of relief and admiration. In his years of working in hospitals, he had seen heroes in many forms. Doctors, nurses, even strangers who stepped in at the right moment. But never a small stray puppy dot. By late morning, the baby was stable. It lay wrapped in a soft blanket, its tiny hands moving slightly as it slept peacefully inside the warm incubator. The nurses took turns checking its vitals, making sure everything stayed steady. Outside, the crowd slowly began to thin, but the story had already begun to spread across town like a gentle wave. The puppy finally curled up on a soft mat the staff had placed near the emergency room door. It seemed tired but content. It had done what it came to do. The hospital staff couldn't stop glancing at it, the tiny, ordinary dog that had done something extraordinary. The doctor stood near the incubator one last time before stepping out for a moment. He looked at the peaceful baby and then at the little dog. A warm feeling spread through his chest. He had seen many complicated surgeries, many moments where science and skill saved lives. But that day, a simple act of instinct and kindness had made the biggest difference. The nurse gently adjusted the blanket around the baby and whispered, "You're safe now." And outside, the sun continued to shine softly on the little hospital, as if even the sky understood that something good had happened there that morning. The hospital was no longer quiet. What had started as a peaceful morning had turned into a day filled with whispers, footsteps, and soft but serious voices. Everyone inside the building now knew about the little baby, who had arrived in a black bag, and the tiny stray puppy that had brought it there. Even the patients who usually stared at their phones or magazines were now talking to one another, their faces filled with wonder. Something truly unexpected was happening, and everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Inside the emergency room, the baby was still lying in the incubator. A gentle warmth surrounded the child, and its breathing was steadier now. The little hands moved slightly every few minutes, and the nurses made sure the soft blanket covered it properly. The machines around the incubator made light beeping sounds, and though the sounds were small, they felt full of life. The puppy was lying on a small mat just outside the emergency room door. Someone from the hospital had given it a small bowl of milk and some biscuits. Its tummy was full now, but it didn't want to go anywhere. It stayed close, like a little guardian, watching everything with curious eyes. Every time a nurse walked by, its ears twitched, as if it was making sure everything was still all right inside. The senior doctor entered the room again, walking with calm but quick steps. He had just spoken to a few officials on the phone. Child services and the local authorities were on their way. This wasn't just a medical situation anymore. It had become a matter of care and protection. But for him, as a doctor, the most important thing at that moment was the baby's health. "How is the little one?" he asked softly, walking up to the incubator. A nurse, who had been carefully checking the baby's breathing, smiled gently. "Much better. Breathing is steady, and the heartbeat is strong. We'll keep observing for a few more hours." The doctor nodded. "Good. Very good." His face relaxed a little. He had been worried earlier, but now, seeing the baby's tiny chest rise and fall regularly, he felt a quiet sense of relief. Meanwhile, outside in the waiting area, people had formed small groups. An old man sitting on a bench told the story to a young couple as if he had seen it all happen himself. "That little dog is something special," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "It dragged the bag all the way here. A smart one, that dog." A group of students nearby listened closely. One of them whispered, "It's like something from a movie." Another replied, "No, this is real." That's what makes it even more special. Back in the emergency room, the baby moved again, just a tiny stretch of its fingers. One of the nurses leaned closer and whispered softly, "You're safe now. You're strong." She didn't know who the baby belonged to or why it had been found like that. But in that moment, she didn't think about any of that. All she saw was a small, precious life that needed care and love. The puppy stood up again and slowly walked closer to the door, its little paws making soft tapping sounds on the floor. A nurse noticed and smiled warmly. "Still watching, little one?" she said softly. She crouched down to gently pat its head. The puppy wagged its tail slowly, as if it understood every word. Then came the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The social worker and a kind-faced woman from Child Services arrived. They walked in with calm but focused expressions. The senior doctor greeted them quietly and explained everything that had happened, from the moment the puppy dragged the bag to the moment they placed the baby in the incubator. The woman listened carefully, nodding as she looked at the sleeping child through the glass. Her eyes softened immediately. "Thank you for acting so quickly," she said gently to the doctor and nurses. "You may have saved this baby's life." The doctor shook his head slightly. "It wasn't just us," he said, glancing toward the door. The woman followed his gaze, and there sat the little puppy, still as patient as ever. She smiled softly. "Wow," she said, "I think we have a little hero here." The nurses laughed quietly, their tired faces lighting up for a moment. The puppy tilted its head, as if it was wondering why everyone was smiling. Soon after, a police officer arrived, not with loud noise or fuss, but with quiet steps and a gentle voice. He spoke to the staff, took a few notes, and then looked at the baby through the glass. Even someone who had probably seen many serious situations couldn't help but soften at the sight of the tiny child wrapped warmly inside the incubator. The nurse who had first opened the bag told him everything in detail. "The puppy wouldn't stop barking," she said. "If it hadn't been so determined, I don't think anyone would have checked the bag right away." The officer smiled slightly. "Then we owe that little fellow a big thank you," he said. Hours passed, but the story didn't slow down. The baby remained in the incubator, and the nurses took turns checking its temperature, breathing, and heartbeat. The puppy didn't leave its spot. It took short naps in between, curling up into a tiny ball, but every time someone walked by, it lifted its head to look inside again. The hospital staff grew more attached to it with every passing minute. Someone brought it a small blanket. Another nurse whispered, "I've never seen anything like this before." In the afternoon, the baby finally opened its eyes for a brief moment. They were tiny and a little cloudy from sleep, but when they fluttered open, the entire room seemed to soften. The nurse standing nearby gasped softly, not in fear, but in pure emotion. "Look," she whispered. "The baby's awake." The doctor came over and leaned down slightly, smiling warmly. "Welcome to the world, little one," he said in a kind voice. The baby didn't understand, of course, but it let out a tiny sigh, as if answering. Outside the door, the puppy lifted its head again, sensing something new. Its tail wagged faster now. It didn't know why everyone inside was smiling, but it could feel the happiness in the air. The social worker began making arrangements for the baby's next steps. But before anything official could happen, she walked over to the puppy and sat down on the floor beside it. "You know," she said softly, "you saved a life today." She gently stroked its head. "You may be small, but what you did was big." The puppy licked her hand, as if shyly accepting the praise. By evening, the sun was shining warmly through the hospital windows, filling the lobby with a soft golden light. The day had changed completely since that early morning. The story of the puppy and the black bag had spread all across town. A few people came just to see the puppy, sitting quietly like a small hero. The doctor walked out of the emergency room and saw the puppy surrounded by smiling faces. "Looks like you've become famous," he said with a kind chuckle. The puppy wagged its tail, its big brown eyes shining dot inside. The baby was now sleeping peacefully, its little chest rising and falling with a calm rhythm. The nurses, though tired, felt a warmth in their hearts. They had worked hard to keep the child safe, but they all knew deep down it was the puppy that had brought the miracle to their door. The nurse who had first heard the soft sound from the bag walked outside with a warm smile. She crouched down beside the puppy, gently scratching behind its ears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Because of you, that baby is safe." The puppy leaned into her touch, its tiny body warm and soft. As night slowly approached, the hospital grew quieter again. But the feeling inside was different from the morning. It wasn't just an ordinary hospital anymore. It felt like a place where something good, something almost magical, had happened. The social worker gently lifted the baby in a soft, warm blanket. The child stirred but didn't cry. The puppy watched closely, as if it didn't want to miss anything. The woman smiled down at the dog. "Don't worry," she said softly. "The baby will be safe now." A nurse knelt down and whispered to the puppy, "You did your part. You saved someone today." And in that small hospital, a beautiful story was quietly being written, a story of kindness, courage, and a tiny puppy with a big heart. As the stars slowly began to appear in the night sky, the little dog curled up on its mat, tired but content. It didn't know it was a hero. It didn't know people were talking about it all over town. All it knew was that it had followed a sound, dragged a heavy bag, and helped someone who needed help. And sometimes, that's what real heroes do, not with loud words, but with quiet, brave actions. The hospital that had once been quiet now carried a special kind of energy. The news of the baby had spread far beyond its walls. People had shared the story with friends, neighbors, and even strangers. Many came just to see the little puppy, sitting patiently outside the emergency room like a loyal guard. But inside, the most important moment of the day was still unfolding. The baby's condition had improved during the day, but it wasn't completely safe yet. Its breathing was steady, but its tiny body was still weak. The doctors and nurses were determined to give the child every bit of care they could. Every small movement from the incubator made them pause, watch, and then work with even more care. As the afternoon light softened and the golden sun began to lower in the sky, the senior doctor entered the room once again. His face was calm, but everyone could see the quiet seriousness in his eyes. He knew the next few hours would be the most important. The baby needed more than warmth now. It needed strength. It needed steady care. And above all, it needed hope. "Let's check everything again," he said softly, walking closer to the incubator. A nurse gently wiped the baby's forehead with a soft cloth. Another nurse checked the monitor that showed the baby's heartbeat. The soft beeping filled the room like a gentle rhythm, a small sign that life was still there, fighting. The puppy lifted its head from its mat outside the door. It could sense that something was happening again. It didn't understand the machines or the whispers, but it felt the change in the air. It stood up slowly and walked closer to the doorway, peeking in with its curious eyes. The doctor gently placed his hand near the incubator, not to touch, but to feel the warmth. "Good," he murmured. "The baby is holding on." The nurses shared small, hopeful smiles, but everyone knew this was a delicate moment. The baby had been without help for some time before the puppy brought the bag to the hospital. The little one needed extra care to stay strong. A nurse adjusted the oxygen level slightly. Another checked the child's tiny fingers and toes to make sure they were warm. Every action was done with quiet focus, almost like a silent promise to keep the baby safe. Suddenly, the baby let out a soft, weak cry. It wasn't loud, but in that silent room, it sounded like a bell. Everyone froze for a heartbeat. Then the nurse quickly leaned closer. "It's okay," she whispered gently. "We're here." The cry was a sign that the baby was still fighting, still breathing, still holding on to life. The doctor exhaled slowly. "This is the moment," he said quietly. "We have to stay ready for anything." The puppy, sensing the slight rush inside, let out a tiny bark. It wasn't loud or alarming, more like a small encouragement. A few of the nurses glanced at the door, and couldn't help but smile. It was as if the little dog wanted to say, "Keep going. You can do it." The baby cried again, this time a little louder, though still soft. A nurse carefully reached inside the incubator with warm, clean hands and gently stroked its tiny arm. "Little one," she whispered lovingly, "you're not alone." Outside the emergency room, people had gathered quietly, hoping to hear good news. The story had touched their hearts. Many of them didn't even know the baby or the puppy, but they felt connected to this little miracle that had happened in their town. Meanwhile, the doctor monitored the heart rate. The line on the screen moved in small but steady waves. It was working. The warmth, the care, the oxygen, everything was helping the baby grow stronger. Minute by minute, the social worker returned to the room. She stood silently for a while, watching the nurses and the doctor work together. She saw the little puppy at the door, sitting still like a small hero who refused to leave. "This," she whispered softly to herself, "is a beautiful sight." The nurse who had been by the baby's side since the morning leaned closer again. She had a kind smile on her face, even though her eyes showed how much she cared. She whispered, "You've come this far. You can make it." For a moment, it was as if time slowed down. The golden light from the sunset shone through the window, falling gently across the baby's tiny face. Its eyelids fluttered, and its lips moved slightly as if trying to make a sound. Everyone in the room watched in silence. The nurse held her breath. The doctor kept his eyes on the monitor. Then, almost like a gift, the baby let out another small cry, this time clearer than before. It was soft but full of life. A wave of warmth filled the room. The nurses smiled. The doctor's shoulders relaxed. One of the nurses had tears in her eyes, happy tears, the kind that come when something fragile and beautiful begins to bloom again. Outside the door, the puppy wagged its tail quickly, letting out a happy bark. It didn't know exactly why everyone inside was smiling, but it felt the joy in the air and joined in with its own small celebration. The senior doctor turned to the team. "We're going to make it," he said softly but firmly. "The baby is getting stronger." A quiet cheer went around the room, not loud, but full of emotion. It wasn't the kind of cheer for winning a game or finishing a race. It was the quiet joy that comes when hope starts to shine in the middle of uncertainty. A nurse gently lifted the baby and wrapped it in a soft, warm blanket before placing it back in the incubator. The little one moved its tiny hand, curling its fingers as if holding on to the warmth. It didn't know how many hearts were in that room, all rooting for its little breasts to keep going. The puppy walked a little closer now, sitting right by the doorway with its ears up and tail gently swaying. Someone knelt beside it and stroked its head. "You're a little hero," they whispered. "You helped this miracle happen." As the sun finally set and the sky turned a soft orange, the hospital lights glowed warmly. The emergency room no longer felt tense. It felt peaceful. The worst moment, the moment when everyone had been holding their breath, had passed. Now, there was hope. A nurse brought a small baby bottle and gently held it to the baby's lips. The little one moved slowly at first, then with more strength. The nurse smiled brightly. "Look at you," she said softly. "You're doing so well." The doctor watched quietly from the side. His years of experience had taught him many things, but moments like these still filled his heart with a kind of joy no words could fully describe. "Every life is precious," he thought to himself. And sometimes it takes the smallest hands or pause to remind us. Outside the hospital, the evening breeze carried the soft sound of people talking. Some still stayed near the gate, waiting to hear what had happened. When a nurse stepped outside and gave them a gentle nod with a smile, a warm cheer spread through the small crowd. They didn't need a speech. That smile said everything. The puppy wagged its tail even faster when the nurse patted its head. "The baby is safe," she whispered to the little dog. "Because of you." Inside, the baby was now resting quietly, wrapped in warmth and safety. The machines hummed softly. The nurses moved with gentle steps. And the doctor stood for a moment, simply looking at the small child who had brought an entire town together. That no one in that hospital would forget that moment. The sound of the baby's cry, the wag of the puppy's tail, and the wave of relief that filled the room like sunlight after a long storm. The puppy finally lay down again, curling up into a cozy ball near the door. It had been a long day for the little creature, but it stayed close, almost as if it knew this story wasn't just about a baby. It was about love, kindness, and quiet bravery. The night grew deeper, and the hospital returned to a soft calm. But the feeling in the air had changed forever. The baby wasn't just surviving now. It was living, breathing, growing stronger. And at the heart of it all, a small puppy had become the unexpected hero of the day. Morning light slowly returned to the little hospital, wrapping everything in a soft golden glow. The sun's rays touched the walls, the hallway floors, and the glass of the incubator inside the emergency room. The baby, once weak and silent, now slept peacefully, wrapped in a warm blanket. Its tiny chest moved steadily up and down, each breath soft but strong. It was a new day, a day that carried the soft joy of a miracle. The puppy was still curled up near the doorway. It had slept through the night without leaving its spot. A nurse who arrived early for the morning shift smiled as she saw the little dog resting like a loyal guard. "You're still here," she whispered softly, crouching down to gently stroke its head. The puppy opened its eyes, wagged its tail slowly, and gave a quiet little yawn. It looked tired but content, as if it knew it had done something truly special. Inside, the doctor entered the emergency room with a cup of tea in his hand. He wasn't a man who smiled often, but this morning there was a softness in his expression. He walked to the incubator and looked down at the baby. The child's tiny hands were tucked close to its chest, and a hint of rosy color had returned to its cheeks. He placed a gentle hand near the glass, not touching, but just standing there, quietly thankful. The nurse joined him. "The baby's doing well," she said with a smile. "Strong breathing, stable heartbeat, good temperature." "That's wonderful," the doctor replied softly. "This little one is a fighter." A small sound came from behind them. It was the puppy, padding softly into the room. One of the nurses had opened the door, and the little dog walked in slowly, its ears perked and tail wagging lightly. It sat down near the incubator, tilting its head as if checking on the child. The nurse laughed softly. "It's like it came to visit," she said. "It's more than that," the doctor added gently. "It's part of the story now." Outside the hospital, the town was already buzzing. The story of the puppy and the baby had reached almost every corner of the neighborhood. People who had never even stepped inside the hospital were now talking about it. Some said it was a miracle. Others said it was fate. But everyone agreed on one thing. It was a story that touched their hearts as the morning went on. More people arrived at the hospital just to see the little dog. Some brought biscuits, some brought warm blankets, and some just came to smile at the tiny hero. The puppy didn't seem to understand why so many people were looking at it, but it wagged its tail anyway, happy to receive the love and attention. Inside, the baby was growing stronger. The nurses were able to take the child out of the incubator for short periods now. One nurse held the baby gently in her arms, rocking it softly. The little one blinked sleepily, letting out a tiny sound. It was peaceful, safe, and loved, a very different world from the one it had known before the puppy had found it. The social worker arrived again with a few people from child services. They spoke softly with the hospital staff, making sure everything was in order. But before doing anything official, the social worker knelt down beside the puppy who was sitting proudly near the door. "Well, little one," she said kindly, "you really did something big. You saved a life." The puppy tilted its head, as if it was listening carefully, then wagged its tail again. It didn't understand the words, but it understood the kindness. The doctor approached the social worker. "The baby is stable now," he said. "We can transfer them to a special care home when the paperwork is ready." She nodded. "We'll make sure the child is placed somewhere safe and warm," she promised. "And as for this little hero," she glanced down at the puppy, smiling, "I think it deserves a good home, too." The nurses, overhearing her, all turned their heads at once. Over the last day, many of them had grown attached to the puppy. It had stayed quietly, never once causing trouble. It had simply waited, like it knew it was part of something important. One of the nurses raised her hand shyly. "If no one else takes it," she said, "I will. I'll give it a home." Her eyes sparkled with kindness. "It deserves a family." The social worker's smile grew warmer. "Then it looks like our little hero already has someone waiting." The puppy, unaware of the conversation, wagged its tail again and nuzzled the nurse's hand. It had found a friend without even trying. Later that day, the baby was carefully moved from the incubator into a small crib. The nurse who had stayed by its side through the night carried it gently. Everyone in the room gathered for a moment to look at the tiny child. The doctor, the nurses, the social worker, and even the security guard who had seen the puppy first were there. No one said much. They didn't need to. Their eyes held everything. The shock of that morning, the fear, the hope, and now the quiet joy. The nurse placed the baby back in the crib. The puppy walked up close, sniffing the air curiously. One of the nurses laughed. "You really won't leave, will you?" The baby's tiny hand moved slightly, and for just a brief moment, the soft light from the window made everything seem even more magical. The nurse reached down to pat the puppy gently on the head. "You two are connected now," she whispered as the afternoon sun grew bright. The hospital prepared to transfer the baby to a children's home where it would be cared for until a loving family came forward. The town had already started to talk about how they could help. Some wanted to donate clothes. Others offered toys, blankets, and milk. People who didn't even know the baby felt like it was already part of their community. Before the baby was taken, the social worker and nurses made a little stop at the emergency room one last time. The puppy followed, its little paws tapping softly on the floor. They stood together for a moment, the tiny baby in the nurse's arms and the small dog sitting right beside her feet. The doctor looked at both of them with a gentle smile. "I've seen many things in my life," he said softly, "but this is something I'll remember forever." The nurses nodded. The puppy let out a small bark, as if agreeing. When it was time to go, the social worker carefully carried the baby to the waiting car outside. The puppy followed for a few steps, its tail wagging slowly. The nurse who had decided to adopt it picked it up gently in her arms. "Come on, little hero," she whispered. "Your story isn't over either." The people gathered outside waved softly as the car slowly drove away. No one knew what the future held for the baby, but everyone believed it would be bright. After all, its story had started with something rare, an act of pure kindness from a small stray puppy. Days passed, then weeks. The story spread far and wide. Newspapers wrote about it, calling the puppy a hero. People shared pictures of the little dog sitting proudly at the hospital door. But for the nurse who adopted it, the puppy was not just a hero. It was family now. She named it Lucky, because it had brought luck and hope on a day when both were needed most. Lucky adjusted quickly to its new home. It had a warm bed, toys, and a full bowl every day. But most of all, it had love. The nurse often thought about the day it dragged that black bag to the hospital. She would sit on her couch, gently scratching Lucky's head, and whisper, "You changed a life that day. And somewhere not too far away, the baby was growing up in a loving foster home, surrounded by warmth and care. The child's first days had been difficult, but they had been rewritten by a tiny dog with a brave heart. Years later, people in the town still remembered the story. It wasn't just a story about a baby and a puppy. It was a story about kindness, about how one small action could change everything. Parents told the tale to their children. Teachers spoke about it at school. And every time Lucky walked through town with its new owner, people smiled and waved. The hospital also kept a small photo of that day on its wall, a picture of the puppy sitting proudly near the emergency room door, looking up at the building as if it had always belonged there. It became more than a memory. It became a symbol of hope. The doctor who had cared for the baby often stopped to look at that photo. He would smile softly and think, sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they just have wagging tails and kind hearts. The nurse, Lucky's new owner, never forgot the way everything started. A quiet morning, a strange bag, and a brave little dog. She would often visit the children's home to check on the baby, who was growing healthy and happy. Every visit filled her heart with warmth. It reminded her of the power of kindness. In time, both the baby and the puppy had found families and love. Their lives had crossed for a reason, not by plan, but by a quiet, beautiful twist of fate. And so the story lived on. A story that began with a curious puppy and an old black bag. A story that touched hearts, brought a town together, and proved that even the smallest creatures can create the biggest miracles.